today we're going to be talking about Chinese empires. Specifically, we'll be talking about two important early dynasties, the Qin and the Han. So the rise of the Qin dynasty comes about at the end of the Warring States period. And how it works is the Qin rulers adopt a couple different strategies that eventually allow them to defeat all of their rivals and to emerge as the sole ruling group within eastern China. And this happens in a couple of different ways. First of all, the Qin exist on the western edge of traditional Chinese civilization. And by expanding westward, they're able to increase their territory without having to fight anybody else. This allows them to have a larger population, which allows them to field a larger army and to defeat the other people that they are fighting against. They also undertake important agricultural reforms, building canals to help places farther away from the Yellow River to be agriculturally productive. And so all of these reforms allow the Qin to emerge as the most powerful group during the Warring States period and eventually to conquer and rule all of China. They also employ certain brutal tactics that will be reflected later in the rule of the first Qin emperor. One thing is that the Qin soldiers were rewarded for every head of an enemy soldier that they brought before their generals. And so what this meant is that anybody who fought against the Qin would be executed if they were captured. One army of 400,000 was captured by the Qin army at one point, and all 400,000 prisoners were beheaded. That's almost 500,000 people that were killed because of this Qin policy. They also would perform certain terrifying acts of psychological warfare in their battles, like forcing groups of prisoners to commit suicide on the battlefield to freak out their opponents and to give them the psychological edge in the battle. It's both because of these rational reforms like agriculture reform and westward expansion, and also because of these brutal, no mercy type of tactics that the Qin emerge as dominant. What this means is that finally, after 500 years, China has a single ruler and can begin to function as a single cultural unit once again. To emerge, and the only emperor of the Qin dynasty is Qin Shi Huangdi. And he is a controversial ruler because he does a lot of really great things, but also a lot of really terrible seeming things. And I want you to think about, as I talk about this guy, whether he was a good ruler or a bad ruler, or what even makes a good ruler or a bad ruler. But the first thing that Qin Shi Huangdi does is he eliminates the feudal system. Remember how for the Zhou, it was all about local lords kind of doing their own thing and just helping the king whenever it was necessary. Shi Huangdi gets rid of this. Instead, he implements a bureaucracy. And what a bureaucracy is it's government by loyal officials to the central government. So rather than relying on a central lord, he sends out a loyal official to an area and tells them to rule that area. It's kind of like the system of satraps set up by the Persian emperors. And just like the satraps, these Chinese bureaucrats are observed by government spies. That way they are not tempted to become corrupt or raise their own army and try to become powerful on their own. This, all in all, leads to government centralization and allows for the emperor to bring about certain important reforms. One such reform is road and canal construction, and this helps to bolster trade, and the canals also help to make agriculture more productive because you can use it for irrigation and stuff like that. But, so Shi Huangdi, to achieve all of this, breaks a lot of ancient traditions. And anytime you break an ancient tradition, you're going to upset a lot of people who like these traditions. This happens for Shi Huangdi. In response to all of this criticism, he burns all of the books that criticize him or that espouse any kind of philosophy that's different from what he thinks is correct. So we have one of the first recorded book burnings in all of human history. He also has 400 very important Chinese scholars buried alive in a huge pit, because these scholars were espousing ideas of government that were different from Qin Shi Huangdi's very iron-fisted way of ruling. So the great achievements of Shi Huangdi are several. The first is he constructs an extremely powerful and centralized state. Most historians agree that China under Shi Huangdi was the most powerful civilization in the ancient world at that time. They had the largest population, the biggest army, the most advanced technology. A couple of symbols that demonstrate just how powerful the Chinese government had become can be seen in certain vast building projects that Shi Huangdi undertakes. The first of these being the Great Wall, which you have all heard about before. And so Huangdi builds this by connecting various defensive walls on the northern border of China together to create a single continuous defensive structure. And it stretches for thousands of miles all the way from the ocean to the deserts and mountains to the west of Chinese civilization. The reason that this wall was built was to protect the Chinese people around the river valleys, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, from the raiding nomads to the north. This is modern-day Mongolia, and it's where the Mongols would eventually come from and defeat China, but that's not for a long time. But so this divides Chinese civilization from the quote-unquote barbarian north. But to construct this wall, Shi Huangdi had to raise an army, basically, of hundreds of thousands of workers. And they worked on this for years. And most historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of workers died in the construction of this wall. And in fact, if you died while you were working on the wall, your body was simply thrown into the wall to help build it higher. You would become more or less a brick in the wall. And so once again, you have to think, all right, Shi Huangdi achieved this amazing thing, but he only did it through these really brutal tactics. Shi Huangdi also constructed one of the most elaborate and impressive tombs of all time, perhaps only bested by the Great Pyramids of ancient Egypt. So it's a vast complex that actually is a symbolic representation of China. There's a central burial chamber where Shi Huangdi himself was supposed to be placed, and it's surrounded by walls and a city of the dead. And the city of the dead included stables where thousands of real horses were sacrificed, and is guarded by more than 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors. And each of these warriors was, it's not like they made a mold and made 8,000. Each of them was sculpted by hand to represent a different soldier that actually fought in Shi Huangdi's army. And the amount of time and effort that this must have taken shows just how powerful Shi Huangdi had become. There were also rivers of quicksilver running through the tomb, and the amount of mercury required to create an artificial river is just mind-boggling. Anyway, the human costs of this construction project are also evident, because mass graves have been discovered where the workers of the tomb were put to death. And it's believed that Shi Huangdi had everybody who worked on the tomb executed. That way they wouldn't be able to reveal the secrets of the tomb or the hidden passageways or the booby traps that guarded it. And so once again, you see that the emperor has more or less zero regard for human life. Of the Qin dynasty comes pretty quickly. So Shi Huangdi, there's some prophecies that he will die and that China will collapse back into chaos. And he begins, in response to this, to search for an elixir of life that will allow him to live forever. In doing this, he begins to ingest all sorts of weird substances, and these substances actually kill him. I think it was a pill made of mercury that finished him off. After he dies, revolts break out everywhere, which you can imagine would probably happen in any country if you started taking hundreds of thousands of people away from their homes and forcing them to work to death on giant construction projects. In response to these revolts, a peasant leader rises up and unites a bunch of different armies and overthrows the Qin dynasty and establishes a new dynasty called the Han dynasty. And based on this story, I want you to think about whether Shi Huangdi should be considered a tyrant or a great ruler. On the one hand, he murdered millions of people. On the other hand, he united China into a great and powerful nation. And the Han, who came afterwards, benefited from a lot of the advances that Shi Huangdi achieved. So it's worth considering whether he's one or both. Anyway, the Han dynasty lasts for about 400 years, from 200 BC to 200 AD, which coincides with the high point of lots of other ancient civilizations like the Roman Empire. So the Han dynasty, when they rise up, they claim the mandate of heaven in the same way that the Zhou did, which makes sense because the Qin dynasty had been causing a lot of suffering in the human population, and the revolts broke out in response to this, which the Han interpreted as a sign that the Qin dynasty no longer had the mandate of heaven. And the leader who becomes emperor of the Han dynasty was actually a peasant at first. This guy and future emperors adopt a Confucian philosophy of government, which views the emperor as a ruler, as the father of his empire. So the emperor should not live in a brutal fashion, but should govern humanely and justly. And they also believed that education led to excellence. Remember, that was one of Confucius's main idea. And so rather than just appointing anybody to become a bureaucrat or an official, they would only appoint educated people to rule over the provinces. And what this meant is that you could become a member of the Han government just by learning how to read and write. If you became educated, you could rule. And this is one of the first instances that we see of an official system of meritocracy. And meritocracy is where the people who rule are selected for their merits, that is, for their abilities, rather than for some other arbitrary criterion like their wealth or their family. And this makes sense, right? Because the ruler of the whole dynasty started off as a peasant and rose up to become emperor only because he was a brilliant leader. And so meritocracy becomes a defining element of the Han dynasty and of future dynasties. They maintain order and control by keeping a government monopoly on two essential resources, iron and salt. And they can control these two resources and tax them to generate the money they need for government projects. They also control the price of grain by this elaborate system of storing it. And this keeps grain from ever becoming too expensive, which allows the peasants to continue to eat even when times become hard. They also begin expanding Chinese influence farther than it ever has before. They expand to the south, clearing away some of the more tropical foliage and beginning to farm there. And they also expand to the northwest and the northeast. Expanding to the northwest is especially important because they begin to establish connections with the west and trading silk and other luxury items with them. Which is what this long-distance trade is named, is important because it represents the first time that China ever officially engages with other civilizations. And how it works is the Han emperors would support this long-distance trade route by protecting merchants, by setting up garrisons of troops, and also support them by building actual roads and rest houses where traders could stop and rest along the way. And by doing this, they allow for vast quantities of silk to travel westward. And silk is this really unique material that's made out of the cocoons of certain types of caterpillars called silkworms. And only the Chinese know how to make this fabric, but people all over Asia and Europe begin to desire it. And Chinese silks are found as far west as Rome, even farther, to the western edge of the Roman Empire. And so Chinese goods are demanded by everybody all over the world. In return for the silks that they carry westward, China receives vast quantities of gold and silver, along with other luxury items like furs and glass that they can't get themselves. And this leads to an explosion of Chinese prosperity. So the Han have a much less problematic legacy than the Qin dynasty. They are known for bringing about 400 years of peace and stability in China, which is a pretty serious achievement. They're also known for basically improving life both for the wealthy, because they have all of these luxury materials coming in from the Silk Road, but also for the average person, because the canals and roads that they build, along with like the control of grain prices, makes life easier even for the people at the bottom of the social pyramid. They're also known for great achievements in culture and learning. They set the classical example for Chinese art, and you can see in that bronze statue or in that clay pot that I have included pictures of, they achieve some pretty awesome stuff working in those materials. They also established a respect for literacy that goes on to influence and encourage Chinese poetry and writing for thousands of years. Some really amazing technological breakthroughs occur under the Han, including the first production of paper made out of wood pulp, which is how we make all our paper now. The rudder, which allows for the construction of big ocean-going ships. The wheelbarrow, which helps, farmers to be more productive. And acupuncture, which is still used in certain cases as a medical technique today. And the Han are extremely important because they establish a pattern that other future dynasties will follow for more than 2,000 years. What the Han do continues to happen more or less until the 1920s. So from 2000 BC to the 1900s, China runs more or less according to the model set up by the Han. Now that's a pretty impressive legacy. That's it.